Welcome. We are here at the Tustin Area Museum today to interview Joyce Miller. This is a series of videos that we've done with people who grew up here in Tustin who can give us their accounts of what Tustin used to be like in the good old days. So welcome, Joyce. Thank you very much for being here today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to do this.
If any of you watching this video went to Tustin High in the same time frame, you would have known Joyce Miller as Joyce Bixler, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Joyce, tell us a little bit about the circumstances that brought your family here to Tustin.
My grandparents came here in 1917. They actually came here from San Diego. They were a banking family in Kansas to start with. And they came out to San Diego because it was kind of an up-and-coming area down there. Both my grandparents and my great-grandparents came out there. And then there was kind of a boom here with all the citrus that was being planted and all of that. And it was a growing area with Anaheim and Santa Ana and all of that. And so they decided to sell the banks that they had down there and come up here. So my grandfather came up, and along with some investors, they bought the First National Bank of Tustin. And my great-grandfather went on to buy the controlling interest in a bank in Santa Ana. So they were kind of just established there, and they all came. My great-grandfather, I think, came in 1912, and my grandparents in 1917.
Wow.
So my mother was actually born in Chula Vista.
But your parents actually wound up here too.
But yeah, my dad was, his family lived in, they were from Texas. And, but they had moved out to California for the reason that everybody moved to California. There was opportunity. And and they met at Occidental College. And so my mother, of course, had grown up here. And so they got married and stayed here. Then they moved up north, and then the war came and all of that. But they, like so many Tustin people, they came back.
Yeah, that was the World War I era.
It was World War II. Wasn't that long.
Oh, okay.
Not that long ago. Not for my parents.
1917, though, when they first came out here.
Oh, my
They had
grandparents.
nothing
Yeah,
to do
they
with
came
the
out
war.
and stayed.
Just banking opportunities.
Yeah.
So you come
Yeah.
from a long line of bankers.
I do. I went into it myself, and it was like I didn't want to. I'd heard banking all my life. That was the dinner table conversation. It always seemed to center somehow around that, and I didn't want to ever do that as long as I lived. But then during Vietnam, when my husband was going to Vietnam, we knew he was going into the service. And I thought, well, what could I do? I'd graduated from college. I was going to be a child psychologist. And I thought, well, yeah, but you can't just go like from base to base follow your husband and pick up child psychology jobs, hit and miss. What else could I do? Banking, of course. So, and I found really that after having heard about it my entire life, it was a natural thing. I already had the language, already had the mindset. And so it was an easy thing to do. And then I discovered that I liked it. It was fun.
That's great. That's great. Now you went through all your education here in Tustin?
Yeah.
Grade school?
I started at the old Tustin Main School on Main Street, where everybody went, including, the outlying areas, to an extent, all the orange, citrus groves around here and all of that. And we were all together up until probably second or third grade for me, when they started building more schools, because by then it was 1955, and Tustin was starting to grow, and the old Tustin Main School just wasn't enough. But I stayed at Tustin Main because we lived on a citrus ranch down just off of Newport Avenue, and so I stayed at Tustin Main Grammar School and went all the way through 8th grade there. Except the middle of 8th grade, we all had to move. They built the new junior high, and that brought together all of the all of us who had been separated out of the old Tustin Main School, because they'd gone to Mildred Morrow, and they'd gone here and they'd gone there. And all of a sudden, everybody was back together at Columbus Tustin Junior High. So it was kind of like old home week, but not the same, because, of course, when you go to other schools, you become good friends with those people. So everybody had their own clique. So it wasn't like everybody coming back together. There was kind of an old Maine grammar school group of us who sort of stayed together because we had all the same memories of having gone to school.
Yeah, that's great.
So
And you all went to Tustin High.
we all went on to Tustin High. Yeah.
What was the enrollment in those days at
Ooh,
Tustin High?
boy, I don't know. Most of
Remember
the,
what your class size was?
our
then?
class size was, I think, close to somewhere. It was over 500. It was huge. We dwarfed the rest of the school. We were the school. They were, in fact, when we were in grade school, they had to keep shifting us because the original main, grammar school was, it only went up to second grade maybe. And all of a sudden they had to build on they had to expand the school because they couldn't accommodate all of us. They had, instead of having one class of third graders, suddenly they had two, and that was bulging, and it just kind of kept going that way. So, and then, building all the other schools, we were a huge class by the time we got to Tustin High.
Now, was that the facility that we know today as Tustin High, or was that the old?
It was the old one.
The old one.
Yeah, it had the wonderful fountain back in the sort of arched little patios at the back of the main building, and it had the ivy-covered walls.
Do you remember the year they moved from that to the one we know today as?
I don't. I think I was away in college
Oh, okay.
when they made that change.
It's the same location, they just tore the old building down and built new buildings.
Ah.
So it's the same location.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the office that's there now was the same office that was there when I graduated in 1968. That is, or 64. That has not changed.
And what was Tustin like in those days when you were in high school? This was, instead of, we call it today Old Town, but then it was probably called Downtown.
It was town, It was really small. There wasn't, it was, dare I say, dead and dying. It wasn't, when I look back at postcards from the 50s, and that would have been the 50s as I was getting ready for high school, it looks like every little cow town, farm town from here to Bakersfield to, all the way up the center of California. It had it had the look of a town that had planned on being something had it just kept on growing. But it didn't keep on growing that way. And so it just kind of stayed static from the 1920s until late in the 1950s. And there wasn't much here. So we went, by the time we were in high school, we were going elsewhere for fun. They had a drive-through hamburger place up on First Street.
That was my next question for you. So what did you do for fun?
We did, the same thing kids always do for fun. Well, without the drugs. They had a drive-through hamburger joint up here on First Street in Santa Ana. I think it was Oscar's.
Oscars.
Yes.
Yep.
And so we would go there, and you could sit in your car, and they had car service. They had car service, or you could go inside. So that was kind of where you met, like after something or before, maybe going to the movies or something. We went to the drive-in movies. It was Apollo Drive-In. And it was down on Newport because the 55 freeway wasn't here then. So you drove down Newport, and it was down there as you were coming into Costa Mesa. And they had without the freeway, they had what was called a suicide lane at the time. Newport had been originally 2 lanes. It went from North Tustin all the way to the beach, 2 lanes, and that was all they ever needed until the late 50s. And then because of the drive-in being there, you had people coming up from the beach and trying to turn left across Newport. You had people leaving the drive-in at the end of the evening trying to turn left across Newport to go the other direction. So they had to put in a turn lane. But it was a suicide lane because what would happen is that not everybody was going to the drive-in. Sometimes you were just headed for the beach. Other people were coming the other way. So the idea as teenagers was the guys thought it would be great to get into that suicide lane and see if they couldn't force the oncoming traffic out. So it was like a teenage boy standoff thing. It was scary to be a passenger. They developed what they called the Mesa Salute, and I won't go into what that was, but it was, you can well imagine. And you'd hang on, they'd hang on, and as long as they could before somebody would finally chicken out and pull out. So that was part of the fun. We went to the beach, of course, 15th Street in Newport Beach. That was sort of the place to go, and lie out with your suntan oil and, you know, bake yourself for the afternoon. And other than that, there wasn't...
Somebody told me that you were a horsewoman.
I was definitely a horsewoman.
And tell us how that got started and where you rode your horse.
I had always been on horses. People around here, that Ed Cox, who owned Cox's grocery corner here in Old Town Tustin, he had a big horse, and it was a big chestnut with a really light mane and tail. And there's actually, my parents had a picture of me sitting on top of him. I was barely old enough to sit up unsupported, and I'm up on this huge horse, and with this picture. And I was just always on horses. We had some friends who were involved in the horse racing business. And they bred and raised race horses, quarter horses. And they had a ranch up in Reseda, and then they eventually moved it down to Murrieta. And we would go up there. They were college friends of my parents. And so we'd go up, and I was always on a horse up there. I started riding. They used to come to the mountains. We have a cabin in the mountains. And my mother didn't like being up there alone. We didn't have a second car. So Dad would take us up there at the beginning of the summer and leave us. He dropped us there. There we were. It was the same thing my grandparents had done because they had built the cabin to begin with. Same thing, you know, take the women folk up, drop them there, go back to the business world, right? And then go back and forth on the weekends. So anyway, but Mom didn't want to be up there all alone, especially not with a little kid. And so her good friend from college days she and her daughter would come up there, and they were the people who had the horses. They would come up, and her daughter was almost 7 years older than I was. So they would bring a horse for her. And so I would ride on the back with Leanne, and we would go off into the mountains up there. And then they started bringing up, they had bought, maybe just for me, they bought an old circus horse who was 29 at the time. So this was an old circus horse. But the big advantage was that you could tap his knee and he would kneel down. So I could get on him bareback, because I was only 5,
Wow.
you know. But I could get on him that way. And then we would ride, you know. So I went along that way. And then finally when I was 10, my cousin had been given a horse by her dad. Had gotten her a horse, right? But she had a lot of trouble with the horse. She wasn't a seasoned rider and all of that. So they thought, well, maybe I could, you know, handle the horse. And we were living on the citrus ranch. And so I inherited the horse. And then once, he wasn't the horse for me either. He was just not a good horse, just not a nice horse. You know, great on the ground, but he was a great pet. He had been somebody's pet, you know. He was not a riding horse. And so anyway, he, you know, but once I'd had a horse, then of course, even though we didn't keep him, I needed another horse. So then from the time I was 10, I always had a horse.
Had a horse, that's
Yeah.
great.
And so that's what I did, you know, summer and winter, extra time and stuff like that. I did sports in high school, but mostly I was on the back of a horse. And the Irvine Ranch was just a ranch then. And we lived on the far end of East Main Street at the Citrus Ranch. And so it was easy
So there
access.
weren't like zoning issues that you might have today. You could kind of ride wherever you
Oh,
wanted.
you could ride wherever you wanted, as long as you didn't stomp on the crops, you know. And so there are a lot of dirt roads that went between citrus ranches, you know. So I could very easily, if I just wanted to go out for a short ride, I could have a great hour's ride just going on the dirt roads between the citrus ranches.
Sounds to me like a real fun time to grow up in Tustin.
It was a really great time. Yeah, I rode all over Peters Canyon, and I shudder now when I look back and think, what was my mother thinking? I was 10 years old. I was all by myself. I was out on a horse with no saddle for the most part. In who knows where. She just knew I was somewhere out on the Irvine Ranch and trusted that I would be back sometime. I can't imagine what went through her head back then, but they were just, that's how small Tustin was, is that people just did not worry about about anything ever
Wasn't a
happening.
crime.
There was
crime to worry
essentially
about.
no crime to worry about. Nothing had ever happened to anybody. And if I fell off the horse, they always, I guess, had the feeling that somebody would be along to pick me up or something. I did walk home a few times, leaving the horse behind me because, you know, something had happened and I couldn't get back on or something. But you know, Mom was right. Nothing ever happened. I always made it home.
Now, you went off to college, and you talked about the Vietnam era when your husband was
Yes.
in Guam.
Yes.
When did you get back to living here?
Oh, we came back, we went to Guam we got married in 1968, returned here, we thought it was, he got drafted, he joined the Navy, and he got posted at the hospital in Guam because he was a Navy corpsman, right. And it was a 2-year post, it was supposed to be a 2-year posting. So I went over to join him. He ran into a couple who were renting a house up in the hills, you know, in a little village with dirt roads and pigs that ran down the street, wild pigs that came out of the jungle, which was right across the street from the house that we ended up living in there. And so anyway, he found them, and they were, the fellow was in the Air Force, and they were due to be transferred. So we rented the house and moved there, and then I guess they were killing off, I remember them saying, oh, they've killed off too many corpsmen, so Bill, you're next. You know, you have to go to Vietnam. So I came back home again in 70. He got combat training to be attached to the Marines, and then he went to Vietnam. And he came home from there in early 72, I guess it was. And they were closing down, the war was winding down at that point. And so he came back here, and we lived in Orange for a while, and had an opportunity to buy a house in Tustin rather than renting an apartment. And so we did. And I went to work. He went back to college. I went to work. I bought the house. And I can still remember walking around the inside of this house with a realtor. We were both there. Bill's looking at the house. You know, we're both looking at the house. The realtor is there. And I was the career woman. I was a career banker at that point. I was like all of 25. And it's amazing when you look back at those days. And she's saying, and how are you going to finance that? And I said, oh, well, I'll be paying for it. And she said, and your husband works for us? I said, oh, he's not employed. He's back in college again. And she's looking at me like, well, haven't I wasted my time?
Tell us how you ultimately got involved in the Historical Society and developed an interest in preserving the history.
It's funny.
Remember the year?
I think you come to appreciate history as you get older. My mother had been involved in the Historical Society because, of course, she had many stories from the old days and loads of pictures. And she would drag me in for this or that, and she kind of got me interested a little bit. And then my grandmother, my grandparents had lived on Main Street in a Victorian house there, and my grandfather had passed away. My grandmother passed away in 1972, and the house had been sold. We had sold the house, but they wanted it, the Historical Society, or I think it was the Historical Society, wanted it for a home tour, right? And so they needed docents. So my mother was already sort of involved in the museum, and so then she dragged me down there. And so we went in, we were the inside docents, and the house was not open for the tour. It was only the garden. It was a Victorian tea party in the back garden, because my grandmother in her day had rose bushes, and it looked like a Victorian backyard. It had a gazebo and all that kind of thing. And so my mother dragged me down there, and I thought, okay, well, that was fine, and that was as far as it went. And then, my mother just went along. She'd come down and volunteer and do stuff and stuff envelopes and, all the stuff that volunteers did here at the museum. And I pretty much ignored it because I had little kids. I was busy. We had a busy life. And then she passed away. And I had spent a whole lot of years checking on Mom, And suddenly there's nothing to do. The kids by then they were in upper grade school, I suppose. And so you're going, gosh, I remember the old days, I could go down there and see if they need some help. I have some extra hours, And that's just where it starts. And then you get sucked in.
When did you start publishing a newsletter? You remember the year?
Yeah, I think it was maybe about 2000, 2005 or so,
2005.
somewhere along there.
And you did that for many years.
I did that for about 12 years.
12 years.
Yeah.
That's a long time.
It was fun. I enjoyed it because it gave me the opportunity to mentally walk back into the past. You don't, it's amazing, you remember your past. You don't have many opportunities to relive your past, And that would force me to do that because in order to write, I had to put myself into, like, some of these situations. I had to actually see Tustin as I had seen it as a little girl and what we did and that kind of thing. So it's not quite remembering in the way that we usually think of remembering in the past. We don't usually walk back through places, So it gave me that opportunity to do that, and that was a lot of fun. And I learned a lot about history. I mean, you grow up in a town, but you don't think about it. It's just where you grew up. You went to the grocery store, you went to the bank, you went here and there, but there's not real, you lived the history, you weren't interested in the history.
Yeah. Joyce, I understand that you used to do a lot of research for the Home and Garden Tour.
Right, yes, I did. Carol Jordan before me, who was the historian for the Historical Society, she had already done a lot of research on the homes, but because I had to write about them, I needed a little bit more research than what she offered sometimes. And so yeah, I did. I looked into a lot of the research. I became a regular over at the archives in Santa Ana, which is a great place to hang out. And they are so accommodating and so helpful over there. And big books that I got to go through, and sometimes you have to, in order to trace who lived in these houses, sometimes you have to go through these huge books that takes an entire arm just to, turn the pages up, and but to trace these, the owners back and that kind of thing. So I did a lot of that kind of stuff. I enjoyed. I like to do that kind of thing. I'm sort of a researcher at heart. I like to delve into things.
I'm guessing that the research you did for that paid off in the newsletters because you could carry some of the stories over.
Well, and I could remember the names, and I already knew the houses. When I was researching these houses, I sort of knew who had lived there before, or even if I didn't know them, I at least knew the name. I know a lot of names of people who I never knew myself. They were, because my mother grew up here and my grandparents were in the banking business here, they knew a lot of people. So the names are familiar, they stuck. I'd look them up, I'd write about the house, so it was a great way to walk back through time. I could walk back through my mother's life, I could walk back through my grandmother's life, and back through my life too, because I had friends who grew up in these houses where their grandparents had lived perhaps, 40 years before that. All the houses that are old to us now were new to somebody, back then. Even my grandparents' house, I remember somebody going through there and going, what a shame that they painted the inside of this lovely Victorian white. Why would they do that when they had such lovely woodwork? Well, when they bought it in 1917, the house was built in 81. So in 1917, the house was not that old to them. And it was dark, as all Victorians are dark. And my grandmother, they were party people. They threw parties and all that. She liked light and sparkle and all of that. And so, of course, they painted it white. Never looked back.
Well, I guess it was, I think you said 12 years writing the newsletter?
Yes, I think I spent about 12 years doing that.
Was it tough to give that up after you?
It was very hard to walk away from. I enjoy writing. I've written all my life. Yes, it was hard to give it up, but I got to the point where I couldn't, I don't know, I just couldn't do it anymore for some reason. I had to walk away from it, and I had seen that some museums were going to digitals, and that would have been I would have had to have relearned everything from the get-go. It's a different kind of writing. And I don't know, I felt like I would have lost something doing it that way. But I thought it was time, and I appreciated that you could offer more pictures. I was always limited in the number of pictures I could have, because I was limited to 4 pages. I knew how many words I could write for each page. I knew what would fit. I knew how many pictures I could include and all of that, more or less. And it was always kind of a guessing game, but it was more or less, I could do it. But with digital, you can put in as many pictures as you want.
In color.
In color. It can be as long as you need it to be.
And no postage to send
And
it
no
out.
postage. So there were so many advantages to doing it that way. So I started looking for somebody to take it
The price of postage is
over.
going like that.
And yes, it was just taking more and more money to print it all the time. And, museums are on limited budgets.
Well, we all owe you a debt of gratitude for those 12 years.
It was pure pleasure for
Pretty
me.
fantastic newsletter. So.
And I got to see, and doing the homes, getting to write for the homes, I got to go into all the homes first and spend as much time as I needed going through the rooms and sort of soaking up the ambiance. I didn't take down very many details because every home for the home tour, of course, would have docents. And there was no point in me writing about taking down details, for the tour. But I needed the ambiance because that's how I like to write about the houses. I like to write about what it felt like, the times that it was built in and why they were built in the way that they were built. And it was more the history of the homes. I wasn't as interested in the details. That was for somebody else to talk about.
I think you mentioned that your children have not hung around here. They've gone somewhere else.
Yes, they have moved on.
So they're not going to carry on your
No,
interest in tradition and
they're
Tustin history.
they're not. Which is kind of a shame. You have 3 generations in one town. It would have been nice if they had stayed here. But our daughter and her family live in Long Beach. Our son lives up in the Central Valley, and he's the one who could probably have lived here. Except now it's too big a town. He would have liked the town that I grew up in.
Smaller.
Smaller, yes, smaller and more rural.
Don't you think Tustin still has somewhat of a small town feeling, even though it's...
I think it does. When you talk to people who came here from Irvine, who maybe came to Orange County, and they first went to Irvine, and they're almost relieved to have found Tustin because Irvine didn't fit them. It wasn't their kind of town. And then they discovered that Tustin still has the old town feeling, and you run into the
Irvine
people.
does not. I moved out.
It just
I moved
doesn't.
here 6 years ago.
Yeah, I worked for the bank in Irvine just as UCI was starting to grow up. And the housing developments were just going in at that time. And everybody was centered on everything was centered on the university at that time. And but it had no core. They were all from somewhere else.
If you like old, there isn't any old there.
There is no old, there is no town, there is no old.
And here, it's lovely. I
People-
love Old Town.
Once you start having families, you want roots. And Tustin's a place you can put down roots. Irvine, just not so much, I don't think. At least not to me.
Yeah. I love Old Town and love to promote it.
Oh, I talk about it. I live part of the year up in Idlewild, which is also an old town that I grew up in, in the summers. And when I'm up there, I'm telling everybody about Tustin and how wonderful it is. And then when I'm down here, then I talk to people about how wonderful Idlewild is, So it's like having a foot in 2 worlds, but they're both old towns, and they're both places where you actually sink roots into, and people whose families have been there for 50 years, and you've got all access to all the old stories, and even people you don't know about, for better or worse sometimes.
Well, Joyce, the Home and Garden Tour has been an annual event for the Historical Society, and one of the very bad things about COVID-19 was we had to skip the Home and Garden Tour,
Right.
which was our biggest fundraiser, but it's also a lot of fun. And
Yeah,
just a great
absolutely.
event. But one of the good things, and there are very few good things about COVID-19, is it gave us a time to totally renovate the museum. And
Yeah.
you remember the old days, isn't it wonderful now?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is light and it is bright. It is. I had been on the board. I had wanted to redo things at that time, but it hadn't occurred to me to go to this extent to lighten and brighten it. And then I was down on Balboa Island. And I went into their new museum down there and went, how lovely! And I'm no spring chicken. What I realized, and have for a number of years, is as you get older, your vision is not as good. And light becomes really, really important. And so I came back and I talked about the Balboa, or actually it's Newport Beach Museum, but I talked about that. And so people started going down there and going, this is marvelous. So the current board looked at what we could do here to sort of come up to that standard, because it did. It broadens the interest range for people. It makes not just old people want to come in like me, but it makes younger people, it draws younger people in. It shows off. It's like when you furnish a house, you know, you don't want the entire house to be antique. You want the antiques juxtaposed to something more modern, because that makes them stand out. Mm-hmm. And that's what we've sort of done here, is to try to highlight them, because they're in something a little bit more lighter, brighter, and more modern.
And we were forced to close down, so it gave us...
So it was great timing, because the floors had to be redone.
Speaking of light, look at the change in the floors.
Yes, they were dark. They'd had, since 1923 or 24, people had been walking on them when this building was something besides a museum. And they were dark, they were worn, they'd been stained that way to begin with. And now
we
have a lot of white paint.
Brightened up everything.
It had a better lighting system.
Anybody watching this interview that hasn't seen the new museum needs to come down.
They absolutely should. They will. I wasn't here. I was in the mountains for the summer as they were doing all of this. So I knew kind of what their plans were, but not really. So when I walked in, after having not seen any of the upgrading that was going on, I was absolutely blown away. So I was thrilled that they had done this. It was something whose time had come. Because old buildings are great, but you can't appreciate them when they're sort of shabby, and that's what old becomes after a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's really a whole different experience if you come in now versus a year or two ago.
I think so.
Yeah,
And I think it also gave us a chance to take out some of the stuff that had been here that had outlived its usefulness and all of that, and to pick out the stuff that seemed to have more importance and more relevance to younger people coming in. We do third grade tours here, We don't want these people to come back when they're 42 and go, oh, I remember when we saw that in third grade, It was time.
Well, Joyce, on behalf of the Tustin Area Historical Society, we would like to thank you very much for all of your contributions, not the least of which was that newsletter for 12 years, but all the other involvement you had with the Home and Garden Tours and everything else. We've been delighted to have the interview with you. I've really enjoyed our time together, and I'm sure our viewers will feel the same way, that they've profited from hearing about the good old days in Tustin.
Yeah, as you can see, I could go on forever and ever, so they really need to come in someday when I'm here, and I will. I'll tell them lots more.
So, once again, thank you very much, Joyce.
You're welcome. I've enjoyed it.
An interview with Joyce Miller.